Good evening. Thank you all for coming this evening, and thanks to Silvia Rodriguez, to the SMU, and to the UNM campuses for hosting our visit. I'd like to start today's talk by trying to, Sylvia gave me a huge assignment to try to link land and identity in New Mexico. And I thought, as a historian, I would even go a little further. I'd take you to the 1521 kind of conquest of Mexico by Cortez and take you to the Great Depression. And in very broad strokes, what I'm going to try to describe this afternoon or this evening is essentially a transition that we see throughout Spanish America from feudalism to capitalism, from collective communal identities to individualism, that is sometimes described as the movement from ethnicity to citizenship. Now, I first learned of Reies Lopez Tijerina in probably about 64, when I was only 13 years old, primarily because my mother, whenever we would gather at the dinner table, would always tell me stories about the bad old days of the Depression when they used to have to eat, just scraps that were collected from different places. And though the family had originated as an aristocratic family coming to New Mexico in 1706 as part of the Tomé land grant, that is, Tomé de Dominguez was given in 1706 a large land grant that was putatively a communal one, but over time, some of the errors of the land grant claimed that it was actually an individual one, and that other members of the land grant were actually trespassing on the land grant. So my mother would tell me the stories of how they had been very prosperous farmers. And then when the Depression came, they were forced to leave the land. They were forced to essentially become wage laborers. Her sisters working in the house of the Conroy Ranch, and her brothers and father working as field hands on the ranch. So she heard that this Alianza Federal de Mercedes had been created by this man named Tijerina, who was helping the poor Hispanos to regain their lost lands. So my mother and her sister started going to meetings of the Alianza because they thought they could get back the land grant portions that they used to have. And so that was my first contact with Reies Lopez Tijerina. In 1978, I was working at the New Mexico State Records and Archive in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And every day, I was there for a year, every single day, typing away, studying the archives of New Mexico. And this elderly man, he wasn't that elderly at the time, would always come in. And Myra Ellen Jenkins, of whom we just heard a few minutes ago, was then the state historian and archive manager. And every time Tijerina would come into the archive, she would go like a wild cat. She would just turn green and start cursing at him. And then after he'd leave, she'd come up to me and he'd say, I know where those documents are that he wants, but I'm not going to tell him where they are. So that was kind of the second encounter. But we became friendly at the archive because I would frequently help Tijerina translate things in the old Spanish archives that he couldn't exactly read. And so next, I encountered him at the National Chicano Studies Association meeting in 1985, where he summoned me to his room. He had read my book, When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away, and he wanted me to write about his life, particularly his religious life. So in 2005, I collected all the sermons that he had written from approximately 1946 to 1958. That is, he was a very charismatic Pentecostal preacher that was traversing most of the United States. He would have revivals in New York, and in California, in Texas, in Canada. He was a very popular speaker on the Pentecostal revival circuit. And so I started translating from Spanish to English his sermons. And he had detested all the other translations of his work that were in print, but he was quite happy with mine, and he gave me the blessing to continue. Now, what I want to tell you that today, my argument, if there's an argument to this talk, is there's nothing particularly unique about the loss of Hispano land in New Mexico and southern Colorado. The same processes unfolded in different places with different casts of characters, with local twists and turns. And it happened in Mexico, it happened in Peru, it happened throughout the Americas. New Mexicans tend to have the impression that the land grant issue is a very hot and particularly potent issue in New Mexico, but it has been for the last 150 years throughout the hemisphere. Now, I wanted to, for those of you who may not know all the basic categories of Mercedes, I wanted to give you the kind of categorization just so that you know the complexity of them. The first kind of land grants were given to pueblos indígenas, or the Indian towns and villages, who were mostly in Mexico, in the Central Valley of Mexico and in the southern parts of Mexico, but also the only place that dense sedentary agriculturalists were found in New Spain and the far north were along the northern Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico and southern Colorado. Now, as you heard about the new pueblos, or the pueblos nuevos, or the colonias, were frontiersmen and women who were granted land to safeguard the territories from, foreign incursions. At this point, it was the Apaches, the Comanches, the Utes, the Navajo. And the main irritant was that silver had been found in north central Mexico in Zacatecas in 1546, then in Guanajuato and San Luis Potosí. And by 1700, 2/3 of all the world's silver was coming from the northern silver mines of Mexico. So it became absolutely imperative, lest the French, who had already established New Orleans, lest the British colonists, who were already starting to move across the United States, lest the Russians, who were moving down into California, attacked the silver mines, which was the main source of income for the Spanish Empire. They sent out a group of colonists to start new towns to safeguard the approach to the mines, again, from also the Comanches and the Apaches, who by 1750s were becoming particularly potent and particularly hostile. That is, the Presidio of Santa Fe had at the most at any one time 100 soldiers who could bear arms. The Comanches could mobilize anywhere from 10,000 to 40,000 warriors armed and mounted at any one time. So they were no comparison to the Spanish troops. Then secondly, places like New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, California were created and kept, San Antonio for that matter, in order to provision the silver mines. And so from New Mexico became the producer of woolen goods, blankets, gloves, socks, Pueblo Indian pottery, livestock, the hides, salt, and pine nuts, and that's what became the staples. And then you had the individual land grants that were usually given to the leader of an expedition who would if he recruited his own soldiers, his own settlers, then it was an individual grant and they would share in the prosperity of that grant. These were men who considered themselves hidalgos or aristocrats or adelantados, special envoys of the crown. Now, Mercedes had mixed ownership and use. So, for example, the part that was considered private ownership were the plots on which people would build their houses, or the solares. Then you would have the agricultural fields attached to private ownership, which were the suertes. And then you were usually given some kind of land for livestock raising, which are the sitios de ganado mayor, which were for cattle and horses, and the sitios de ganado menor, the sheep, goat, and pig grazing areas. The collective use plots were considered propios or ejidos, pastures, forests, uncultivated and inalienable land. And then there was a big category of land that was called the royal lands, the tierras realengas, that were used locally, but were always the property of the state or the sovereign. This is going to be the category that's going to most upset landholding in New Mexico, along with the municipal lands, or the tierras concejiles, used to support villages and towns and whatever needs they might have. Now, the capitalist assault on communal lands and communal holding of lands and identities that were tied to those lands really starts in Mexico, New Spain, with the secularization of the missions, that the doctrinas that were run right shortly after Mexican independence in 1821, the Mexican state started secularizing the doctrinas, the Indian missions, that were run by the religious orders. The religious orders were using these communal lands for their own aggrandizement, and the goal was to make the Indians independent, individual owners of land no longer managed by the orders. The next big major shift in Mexican law comes in 1856, which are called the Leyes de la Reforma, the reform laws, or the Ley Lerdo, but its official title was the Ley de Desamortización, which is the disentailment of lands held in common by the church, by professional guilds, and by indigenous communities. Now, Indian communal lands were very quickly subdivided into private plots and very quickly alienated. The intent of the law was to push small landholders and landless peasants off the land and to transform them into wage laborers, which they successfully did. Now, From 1876 to 1910, you may or may not know that Porfirio Diaz was the president of Mexico, and among the things that he moved next to do was to take the communal properties of new towns, those colonies that had been established to protect the silver mines. And he took them in the name of the sovereign. He was the president. It was the Mexican state that wanted these lands. They belonged to the sovereign. He took them. And what he did was that he sold them and gave large land concessions to foreign investors to build capitalist export agriculture in the south and center of Mexico, and railroads and mineral extraction mines in the north of Mexico. And it creates the perfect conditions between 1910 and 1917 for the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution brought together a coalition of two forces: the indigenous peoples of southern Mexico and central Mexico who had lost their ejidos, their common lands, led by Emiliano Zapata, and the emergent landholding bourgeoisie, the elite landed class of the north that revolted against Diaz essentially taking their land and selling it off to English and American investors. As you know, the revolution was successful. It overthrew Diaz, but it put in its place then the large landholders of the north of Mexico, and the haciendas, the large landed estates, remained intact. Now, the Constitution of Mexico at the Revolution said, Article 27, that they promised that the communal lands that had been seized under the Ley Lerdo, or the Ley de Desamortización, would shortly be returned. And Mexican heads of states waffled on and off, showcasing a few ejidos that they returned between 1917 and 1934, but instead embraced a liberal U.S.-inspired model of capitalist development, which was based on individual private enterprise. Peasant revolts occurred particularly after the Depression in 1929. So the next president who came in to quell the angry peasants essentially started distributing 50 million acres back to the indigenous rural poor, primarily giving away about 50% of the rural agricultural lands in Mexico, and mixing them in giving private and collective farms, so that you would get a private plot that was your own to farm, but then you were also supposed to contribute to work in the collective farm that was producing, let's say, henequen for the rope markets of Europe, sugar, coffee, cotton, and things of that sort. The ejidos were never particularly successful, and I give you this background because Reies Lopez Tijerina goes to Mexico in the late 1950s when the glow of the ejido is still sparkling, and he comes back with a ejido model from Mexico, thinking that he can reimpose it on the United States and particularly the Southwest. Now, New Mexico went through the same kinds of transformations that Mexico went in this period. In 1848, Mexico lost the war to the United States, and it did so because it had fought Texas during the Texas Revolution, and the principal irritant were the Comanches. It had fought the independence battle, and again in the north, the Comanches and the Apaches had weakened the Mexican state and its military. And again, during the U.S.-Mexico War from 46 to 1848, the Comanches and the Apaches were major players in essentially weakening the Mexican state and leaving it without the necessary forces to repel American advances. And so the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised to protect Hispano property rights, and did and didn't. We'll see the record in a few minutes. In 1854, the Office of Territorial Surveyor General comes in and validates a few of the Spanish and Mexican land grant claims that existed, but many were left unresolved until the end of the century and the beginning of the 20th century, when the Court of Private Land Claims reviewed thousands of claims and validated only about 35% of all the individuals that came claiming land. The federal government appropriated the commons from the ejidos and the tierras realengas, the royal lands, because it saw itself as the new sovereign, and as the new sovereign, these lands belong to the sovereign. And there you get the creation of the Kit Carson and the Santa Fe National Forest. Now, how Hispanos lost their land, the story that's usually told is a very kind of Manichaean, black and white, Hispanos versus Anglo story, but it's not that simple. I mean, it's a very complicated process, and no one model fits the description of all. But the internal factors among the Hispanos that were living in New Mexico between 1848 and 1960 was that many of them had inadequate documentation of the initial grants that Michael was just telling you about, going to the courts and going to having actual deeds. And when conveyances had occurred, they were not accurately recorded and documented. Then there was infighting between rich Hispanos, the ricos versus the pobres, the people who had access to land and the people who had no access to land. There were conflicts over whether an initial grant that was made, let's say in 1706, which was my mother's history, whether the land that was given to Tomé de Dominguez in 1706 was a communal or was it an individual grant. So the litigants fought about that. And then there was a morsalization of land because of the generations that had lived on it. That is, the planting lands were a limited amount of land, and with each generation, more and more children were being born, and that required essentially larger and larger pieces and forcing those who had no access to land into the cities. And then you had many, many Hispano collaborators with outsiders who intended maliciously and willfully to defraud people of their lands. And finally, there was a failure to pay taxes, and it was seized. The external factors were, again, complicated as well. The territorial conquest by the United States set off a chain of events. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, Article 9 promised that Hispanos will, quote, enjoy all the rights of citizens of the United States and will be protected in the free enjoyment of their liberty and property, end quote. Article 10, which said that the land grants that had been given by Spain and Mexico would be inviolable, was taken out of the treaty before the Senate ratified it as a treaty. So there was a new legal regime, one that venerated property ownership vested in individuals. Business was conducted in a foreign language, English, which many of the Hispanos still didn't know. And then there was a willful destruction of land titles by the state archives and by the governors of New Mexico, the Anglo governors of New Mexico. And then you've heard about the Lincoln County Wars and about the Catron and his unscrupulous friends. Well, you had unscrupulous lawyers who arrived en masse, land speculators and investment bankers who all entered in cahoots to monetize land, quickly transferring it and rapidly enjoying massive profits. By 1890, Thomas Catron was the largest landholder in the United States, private landholder in the United States. Now, this process was no different except the pace at which it happened. It happened in California in 1849 because of the gold rush. It happened in Texas in 1845 because Texas became a state. It didn't happen in Arizona or New Mexico until 1912, 1913 fully, and it wasn't really felt until the end of the Depression. A savior arrives. Now, I'm going to go through Tijerina's life because many of you probably don't know anything about him. He was born to a sharecropping family in Falls Church, Texas, right outside of San Antonio. In 1926, his parents were sharecroppers and cotton pickers in South Texas. And in 1944, he was given a Bible, he read it, and was so animated by what he read in the Bible that he decides to become a Pentecostal preacher, and he enters the Latin American Bible Institute in San Antonio, Texas. In 1945, he decided that his mission was to save the world from damnation because he happened to be traveling through Taos, New Mexico on precisely August the 5th, 1945, when we learned about the dropping of the atomic bomb at Hiroshima. And for Reies Lopez Tijerina, who was deeply steeped in the New Testament book of Revelation, this to him was a signal that the apocalypse was arriving, the human destruction of the planet, and his message then became one of asking people to renounce sin, to turn to Jesus Christ as their Savior, and to essentially become good Pentecostals. So he starts crisscrossing the country as a Pentecostal preacher, and by 1955, 1945, he had about 50 hardcore followers who would do anything and go anywhere. And they started this utopian community in near Phoenix, Arizona, called the Valle de la Paz, or the Valley of Peace. They were driven out of there by their neighbors who didn't like them, didn't like how they worshiped, didn't like what they were doing. And it was in 1956, on April 8th, he was in Visalia, California, staging a Pentecostal revival, when he had this magical dream. And it becomes essentially the guiding dream for the rest of his life, because in it, God appointed him, Reies, to essentially be the anointed savior who would lead people from the lost land to the promised land, and who would essentially protect them and bring them justice. Now, it took him a long time to figure out where this promised land was, but eventually he came to the conclusion that it was in Tierra Maria in northern New Mexico, where the land grants existed. And I told you of his trips to Mexico to study the ejidos, to get copies of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the laws of the Indies. And by 1963, then, he used the Alianza, or the Mutual Aid Society model, to start the Alianza Federal de Mercedes in Albuquerque. Notice that he doesn't start it in Tierra Maria or in Taos or in Santa Fe. He starts it in Albuquerque because most of the dispossessed people that had left their land in the 1930s had migrated to Albuquerque, Los Alamos, or Santa Fe to essentially enter into wage work. So from October of 63 to October of 66, he was organizing grantees left and right. The Alianza was growing. He was constantly writing letters to the presidents of Mexico and the United States, asking for redress of this lost land. Nobody would listen to him. Finally, you saw some of the no trespassing signals that David gave you, those things that Alfonso Sanchez collected. And so there was an eviction notice to all the Anglos who were on putative Hispano land on October the 1st of 1966. U.S. is trespassing in New Mexico, and they littered the county with these eviction notices. U.S. has no title for New Mexico. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is a fraud and invalid. Estados Unidos no tiene jurisdicción en Nuevo Mexico. The United States has no jurisdiction in New Mexico. All trespassers must get out of New Mexico now. All pirates go home. All Spanish and Pueblo Indian land grants are free forever. All trespassers will be punished by the law. Vivan los pueblos libres, las repúblicas libres de Nuevo Mexico. Long live the free city-states of New Mexico. And as you may or may not know, from October 15th, 1966 to October 26th, the original heirs, or the people who said they were the original heirs, reestablished the Pueblo República de San Joaquín del Río de Chama and restored it, which was in the Kit Carson National Forest. And there was a big confrontation between the forest rangers and the police with the members of the Alianza. A year later, nothing had changed. And so according to Alfonso Sanchez, this is the district attorney's word, that on June 3rd, they were getting together in Cangilón to plan a major showdown. And that he arrested the members of the Alianza that he found because they were planning to essentially violate property rights. And so what happened was he did jail 11 members of the Alianza, put them in jail at the Tierra Maria courthouse, and 2 days later, Tijerina and a number of his followers arrived at the courthouse to issue a citizen's arrest against Alfonso Sanchez, who was going to arraign the jailed Alianza members that afternoon. Now notice that I'm never going to use the word that it was the courthouse raid. That is the language of the FBI. That was the language of the CIA. That was the language of J. Edgar Hoover and Alfonso Sanchez and the police state that was against the Alianza. It was a successful attempt to issue a citizen's arrest against someone that had illegally arrested members of his group who were simply meeting together to plan, as David told you, how they were going to execute their rights on land. So the court found him not guilty of essentially of the courthouse fracas. And shortly thereafter, he becomes a leader in the Southwest contingent for the Poor People's March with Martin Luther King in Washington, D.C. And then what essentially pulled his fuse, to use a bad metaphor here, was that from 1969 to 1971, he was put in federal prison for the destruction of federal property. He had burned the sign to the Kit Carson National Forest, those big signs that when you're entering the Kit Carson National Forest, he burned one of those things, and that was the pretext for jailing him for 3 years. Now, when he got out, the conditions of his parole was that he had to get routine psychiatric care. I haven't been able to find his medical records yet, but now that he's dead, perhaps I'll have a little more success. And why exactly, where the psychiatric treatment came in. He describes his solitary confinement in Springfield, Missouri, where he was imprisoned, and that may have had something to do with it. In those days, if you ever saw, what was that movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, about the drugging with psychotropics in a lot of these prisons. Anyway, he was finally out, and he was barred from any participation in the Alianza for 5 years. He starts a new organization in 1972 called the Brotherhood Awareness Conference, where he espouses universal human rights. And he says brotherhood should transcend all political, religious, and cultural boundaries. That was his motto. He dies in El Paso at the age of 88 on January 23rd of this past year. Now, notice that he lived for 88 years, and only 10 of those years did he devote to the land grants in New Mexico. So he has a much broader life, and one of the myths about Tijerina is that everything was about the land grants. It wasn't. He had many other themes that were the continuities of his religious Pentecostal message. First of all, he started as an anti-nuclear activist, and throughout his career, he remained a nuclear activist. In fact, in 1968, he went to the Los Alamos National Laboratory to issue a citizen's arrest against the director of the National Lab at Los Alamos. Throughout his life, from the beginning as a Pentecostal preacher, he was always preaching to help the poor, the orphans, and the widows. He denounced modernity and materialism constantly, particularly its role in weakening parental authority. He was eager and active in fortifying Indo-Hispano culture in the Southwest through a sustainable rural land base. He advanced the idea that Indo-Hispanos had a hate for themselves, that years of colonialism and oppression had bred in them, and that had been eroded by racism, and that they had to love themselves if they were going to prosper. He militated to assure that equal justice was guaranteed to all, particularly the marginal and the poor, and his moral and ethical vision was informed by the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, and that the day of final judgment that was prophesied in Revelations was close at hand. And he would constantly say, already one can see the light of the apocalypse. The land grants in the Southwest was the focus, again, of 10 of his 88 years, and it was a small portion of his life. Now, one of the things that got me into this project was trying to understand how Tijerina went from being a Pentecostal preacher to being a land grant activist. And so I've given you essentially parallel careers here, because you see that the tricks that he learned as a preacher were the tricks he used as a land grant activist. So for example, he always would start his revivals by preaching and reading passages from the Bible. Next, people would tell them about, their bad marriages, their evil neighbors, their rheumatism and arthritis, the pains they had in their backs. And then he would lay his hands on them and cure them of their psychic and physical ailments and their wounded souls. And then they would sing and they would commune and they would offer alms to help the poor. As a land grant activist, he took the same exact strategy for his ritual events. So he would start by preaching now about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the laws of the Indies and what they had promised the Hispanos of New Mexico. Then he would have this period of witness and testimony where people would tell how they had lost their lands and the misery that it had caused to the families. Finally, they would sing, they would dance, they would eat, they would commune, and they would collect the membership dues to allow the Alianza to continue. Now, Tijerina's message as a Pentecostal preacher, when he started in 1945, was that nuclear Armageddon was at hand as a result of the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. He had a shrill critique of modernity and materialism, particularly that the Protestant churches were becoming temples and large edifices that were putting enormous amount of money into how the ministers lived. I mean, he had a critique of Billy Graham that was just lethal. And that these churches were becoming big organizations that were so removed from the populace that they made no sense anymore. The preachers were becoming materialist, paternal authority was waning, and so he preached a restorationist gospel. We had to go back to the beginning of gospel times, back to the primitive church, back to the primitive Christianity, back to the good old days. And that's what he was preaching, because if we were going to survive the apocalypse and be saved and redeemed, Christ's return was close at hand. So as an activist, I mean, he uses very similar kinds of logics and rhetorics. Nuclear Armageddon, it was right here, Los Alamos. I mean, he saw it very close. He was a critique of modernity. It was unbridled capitalism that essentially had led to the immiseration of peons and the working class. The land, language, and culture of Hispanos was in decline. How would you do this? You would return the land, and if you returned the land, the culture, the language, the population would be cured. And they would recuperate their aristocratic origins, they would recuperate their honor, and patriarchy would be saved. He was a very anti-feminist. And that prosperity and dignity would be restored to all. Now, I'm sorry that I didn't translate this for you, but let me read you one of his early writings in 1964. And he says, "La justicia está con nosotros, la justicia hablará por nosotros, la justicia volverá a nuestras tierras. Nuestras vacas tendrán pasto y agua. Nuestros animales ya no pasarán hambres como nosotros. Ya no habrá cercos con picos limitados y partiendo todos nuestros pastos. La tierra volverá a este libre como al principio lo estaba, y se acabará la necesidad de la leche de polvo. Nuestra unión es una unión santa y justa y limpia de toda hipocresía. Nuestra unión está hecha por nuestra tierra y nuestra cultura que tanto la han discriminado. Hemos entrado en una nueva época brillante y llena de esperanza para nuestros hijos, porque primero viene la tierra y luego la buena educación. En esta nueva era y época regirán la ley, la justicia. Por primera vez en Nuevo México, todas las cosas volverán a sus legítimos dueños y ya nadie robará ni oprimirá a los humildes como hasta este día lo han hecho los banqueros y los malos políticos. The good old age will come back when we can pasture our sheep. We will not be hungry again. There will be no fences limiting our access to land." And he writes here, this again, the millennial theme that he uses in 1964. Estaba escrito en los libros de Dios que por 100 años estaríamos olvidados por los gobiernos, por la justicia y por Dios. Pero ahora Dios ha vuelto a sus ojos divinos a nosotros, los pobres, oprimidos y robados, y la justicia ya no más estará congelada ni saboteada por los malos. La lluvia de gracia está lloviendo sobre la tierra de Nuevo México y el sol de justicia comienza a brillar sobre el pueblo que por 100 años había estado en tinieblas de injusticias. Ahora las mercedes volverán a sus dueños legítimos y los ladrones saldrán confundidos en sus propios proverbios. El crimen no paga, crime does not pay. Arriba pues valientes herederos, todos como un solo hombre, vamos a portarnos como hombres que reclamamos una misma tierra, protegida por un mismo tratado internacional. Hermano heredero, despierta del sueño, levántate y ven a ayudarnos. Se trata de la tierra, se trata de los derechos de tus hijos, se trata de tu honor, se trata de tu ciudadanía, y no debes de dejar que los extranjeros pisoteen tus derechos sagrados. Sorry. So again, wake up from your sleep, wake up from your passiveness. God has finally brought this moment upon you. Now, a lot of attempts to devalue Reies Lopez Tijerina come from I think, a misunderstanding of who he is and what he was all about. And this is a common thing that was said about Reies Tijerina probably from about 1979 on, that he was a virulent anti-Semite. Well, the historical record shows that his ancestors were probably crypto-Jews fleeing Spain right after 1492. Diego and Maria Tijerina leave Spain in 1590, reside in Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola, moved to Veracruz and then to Valdecasas in Coahuila, and finally to Tejas, Texas in the early 1800s. In 1979, Reies Lopez Tijerina bought the massive Encyclopedia Judaica because he wanted to write the history of Jews. I mean, he was trying to trace his own ancestry. And so he wrote two books that are not published yet, two manuscripts that he gave me. And one is, the first is My Life, Judaism, and the Nuclear Age. See the continuation. He's still in 1986. He's talking about the nuclear age and the destruction of the world. And then the second book, again unpublished in 1996, called La Historia de la Casa de Israel, or The History of the House of Israel. Now, what Reies Lopez Tijerina does is that he traces the history of Jews from as being the children of Abraham. And if you follow this line here, you see Abraham through the first wife Sarah has Isaac, who has Jacob and Israel, and this is where essentially Jews trace their ancestry back to Abraham. Now keep that in mind, because here is Reies as prophet, where he is a direct lineal descent from Abraham and Joseph. And so he creates two houses. The split that we saw in the previous, the split that we see here with Jacob, he takes in another direction. And let me show you how he does the lineage for himself. So Abraham, Joseph, Jacob. And then we have essentially the house of Judah, which produces Judaism, and the house of Israel, which is the house that Joseph creates, Joseph and then Jacob. And he essentially, look at the parallelisms between this. So he puts Judah in opposition to Joseph and Jacob. He puts that in Judaism, they would kill the false messiahs, and essentially that Israel and the Israelites descend from Joseph and Jacob. This is the line of Jesus, who are the followers of God, who are the line of Abel, who did not kill their prophets, who come from Spain, who come through Christopher Columbus, and Tijerina as the prophet, ergo the persecution. His house was firebombed a number of times. His daughters were raped. His son was raped. And that brings him to Tierra Maria courthouse arrest attempt on June 5th, 1967. Follow the lineage on the other side. So you have Judah, Judaism, false prophets, false messiahs. These are the followers of Satan. These are the children of Cain. These are the people who killed their prophets. This is the house of David. This is where the Ashkenazi Jews come in. He saw Einstein as the producer of nuclear weapons, and Einstein was Jewish. This gave rise to the Jewish state and Zionism, and the parallelism. The Israeli Six-Day War to take over Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, June 5th, 1967. The courthouse arrest, June 5th, 1967. Listen here. Reies as Messiah and prophet. En 100 años o 5 generaciones que los jueces se han burlado de la justicia y de todos nuestros derechos, de las mercedes, jamás había nacido un hombre que uniera a los herederos de todas las mercedes. Jamás se había interesado a alguna persona por la triste historia y suerte amarga de los herederos. Nadie levantaba la voz a favor del pueblo olvidado, ni sacrificaba su vida por defender el interés de los herederos. Pero al fin, después de más de 100 años, sale un hombre y llega un valiente que sacrifica toda su vida por defender y salvar la tierra sagrada que nuestros padres ganaron con sus vidas. Los traidores son igual que los ladrones de tierra. Reclaman ser cristianos sin tener nada de Dios. Así que por amor a nuestra tierra, no presten oídos a los asalariados que por dinero y amor propio andan tratando de infamar esta gran unión de herederos reales. No man has come before as great as Reies Lopez Tijerina, who has united the population and is trying to recuperate their lost lands, taking them back to the Jerusalem. Tijerina is an unsung prophet for, was Tijerina an unsung prophet for redemption of Hispano lands and culture, leading them to the promised land? Or were the Mercedes really the lifeblood of Hispano language, culture, cultural renewal, and economic survival? So I leave you with those two questions that really suffuse the nature of landholding and the legacy of Tijerina in New Mexico. Thank you.